With that being done, let's talk about Aquinas. In fact, first of all, let's do the questions that were set for this. So basically I'm giving the lecture I was going to give in week 9. So what are our questions? First of all, right, what's the difference between creator and created? Or, to use the word that tends to get used, creatures. Creatures in medieval philosophy just means anything created, not necessarily biological things. Right. What's the important term here? Well, I'd say the important term here is difference. Right? And if we're going to break this down a bit, we might ask, are there different types of difference? So we might, for instance, talk about like the difference between things that are of different colours. So you might say something can be a variety of colours, and there's a difference between it being white or black. Right. But equally, we might talk about difference between, say, different types of animals. So say like cat or dog. Right? Is the difference between black and white the same as the difference between cat and dog, or are all these different kinds of difference? And this leads us into another question, which is, like, are there different types of being? So we might, for instance, think about the difference between body and mind, or body and soul. Right? What's the common thing that's a difference in? Right? Or, to use a slightly different example, what's the difference between a cat and a number? Right? These seem to be greater kinds of difference than the sorts of difference we're talking about when we're talking about difference in colour or difference in biological species. Right. Okay. Then we might ask ourselves, okay, so if there's different sorts of difference, and we can see sort of more radical types of difference, which look like maybe different types of being, right? What's the greatest difference? What's the most radical difference we can imagine between things? Right? And for Christian theology, this is the difference between God and creatures. God and his creations. The question is, how are we supposed to understand that difference? Like, is there some common thing that's a difference between? Right. Okay, that's going to be the sort of key theme as we go through the lecture. So what's our second question? Well, our second question sort of follows on from this naturally. Right? If we've been talking about different sorts of things, different types of beings, Oh God. Always clean the board beforehand. Right. You might ask, what's the difference between material and immaterial things? So this is us getting back to that question between the difference between body and mind and body and soul. Right? Because this is fundamentally how it's conceived. Now, I think there's an interesting way of differentiating this question. On the one hand, we might ask, so is matter defined by physics? So if you ask a physicist what's matter, they might turn around and say, well, it's molecules. Those are made up of atoms, right? But somebody else might go, well, okay, what about something like a black hole? Right? We don't know what a black hole's made of. Right? We don't know what's happening inside there. So we'll say, well, okay, it might be mass. Right? It might be mass, the thing that kind of warps space. Right? That's what's essential about matter. And then someone will say, well, what about photons, the particles that light and electromagnetism is made out of? They have no mass, right? And then the person might turn around and say, oh, well, maybe it's energy, right? What we see there is this sense in which physics has historically tried to come up with an understanding of the material nature of the universe. But we might say instead that precisely what defines physics is the attempt to understand matter, whatever it is. Right? So we might instead ask, is physics defined by matter? Right? And historically, matter is understood as what we can interact with in the sensible world. It's understood fundamentally in terms of sensibility. And what comes out of this is that metaphysics gets sort of literally understood as that which is beyond physics, or that which is beyond the sensible. Crucially, that isn't what everybody means by metaphysics, but this is what happens in the theological tradition, right? Metaphysics comes to mean the study of that which is beyond the sensible. What's beyond the sensible? The immaterial. God, angels, and the soul. Okay. There's some more historical stuff I could say there, but I'm probably going into too much detail as it already is. Let's ask the final question. Why is there only one creator? Why is there only one God? Now, it's interesting to distinguish here kind of what we mean by one, or what it is to ask questions about unity or on number. So we might wonder, like, what is it for there to be a number of anything? Like, why are there a certain number of chairs in this room, or a certain number of people who've turned up to this lecture? Right. But you could ask more specific things, like, you know, why are there only 9 planets? Right. Why are there infinite prime numbers? Why are there 3 spatial dimensions and not 7 for some reason? But here's a different sort of question, or rather a question that borders on what we're thinking about here, which would be, why is there only one world? Why is there only one truth? Of course, not everybody's going to agree with either of those things. But that's when we start approaching the topic of why there's one creator and not, you know, 16 and a half. Whatever random number you want to throw out. Okay. That's our methodology done. Let's move on to a bit of history. So, throughout the course, I've tried to kind of give you a bit of a flavour for how Christianity evolved. Sort of show that it didn't come fully formed. There's a bunch of different ways it could have developed. And there were certain things at the beginning of Christianity that kind of were obviously important to it, that eventually kind of got lost or changed in a variety of ways. So, you know, one thing I made clear in the first lecture is that Christianity was always very much a kind of political religion. It was a religion of the oppressed. Right? And the other thing that I said is that the key concept really is the concept of salvation. Right? It's the forgiveness of sin, or the freedom from sin, the freedom from guilt, and the freedom from suffering that is promised by Christianity. That was its big kind of selling point. However, now we're into kind of medieval theology. At this point, the church is this incredibly powerful institution. The Catholic Church, by this point, is the most powerful sort of institution in Europe, right? The Pope has the power to invest kings with the divine right to rule. Right? How does this change sort of Christianity as it was originally thought? How does this switch to a religion of power as opposed to a religion of oppression work? Similarly, and this isn't exactly at Aquinas' point, but eventually the Catholic Church develops this quite neat business in selling what are called indulgences, right? So you pay your priest, and your priest will forgive your sins. Right? The forgiveness of sin ceases to be this promise to the poor and becomes an economic opportunity for the rich to absolve themselves. These two things, this way in which the religion's relationship to power and the religion's relationship to guilt change, are very, very important for understanding why the Reformation happened. Right? Bunch of other historical issues there. But you know, when Martin Luther nails his theses to the door and goes spread all across Europe, and suddenly you get all these forms of Protestant Christianity popping up. This is very much attached to denying that the church has a monopoly on our relation to God. Protestantism is sort of defined by this turn to a more kind of personal God and the ability to interpret the Bible and the world of God oneself. Projecting a bit further forward, this kind of schism keeps happening. Eventually we end up with different sects of Christianity with completely new prophets and new ideas. So my favourite are always Mormonism and Rastafarianism, which you might think are very, very different, but when you start looking at the ways in which they form and their interests, they're actually kind of similar, right? Now, how does Thomas Aquinas fit into this sort of evolving history of Christianity post the Reformation, or up to and post the Reformation? Well, crucially because Thomas Aquinas becomes the theologian of the Catholic Church. Contemporary Catholic doctrine is Aquinas' position. And so everything that splits with Catholicism is fundamentally about a split with Aquinas' understanding of the world and the nature of God. Right? And this has a certain kind of practical sense because priests are trained literally by being given copies of Aquinas. Right? Aquinas becomes the most important thing for priests to be familiar with. Right? That's a very kind of concrete thing. But also, there's a more sort of abstract issue, which is that by the time we get to Aquinas, you know, scholasticism has become this massive movement, right, which now is less concerned with the sort of like big fundamental gestures of early Christianity, and is instead instead obsessed with working out the tiny details of doctrine. Right? So if you've ever heard the phrase, how many angels can dance on the head of a pin? Right? This is a kind of a question which is meant to sort of point out just how trivial Catholic theology became in the era of scholasticism. Now, I don't think any theologian ever actually asked that question, but Aquinas definitely asked the question, can two angels be in the same place at the same time? Right? This question of not just how are we supposed to think about God and ourselves, but how are we supposed to think of the bureaucracy of heaven, right? The nature and hierarchy of angels, like, becomes the kind of thing that theologians are arguing about. So, interestingly enough, Pseudo-Dionysius and Maimonides are two of the major thinkers for understanding the nature of angels. Right? This is what gets called Angelology. Right, so what I want to do now, after giving you that kind of sort of political and theological history, is to show how the text that was set for this week, On Being and Essence, which is a very difficult text, right, in some sense covers everything that I've just talked about. Right, in some sense deals with this question of what's the kind of greatest difference, how do you understand the relationship between creator and creator, how do you understand the relationship between the material and the immaterial, and why is there necessarily only one God, and that God necessarily exists. So what I'm going to do is go through the sort of basic methodological bits that Aquinas draws out, and then show you Aquinas' version of the cosmological argument. So we talked about this when we talked about Ibn Sina. What you hopefully will be able to see is that Aquinas is in dialogue with everybody we've been talking about. You know, there's a kind of dialogue with Augustine, and he's crucially drawing on ideas both from Maimonides and from Ibn Sina in order to formulate this argument. And those ideas ultimately give him something like an angelology and a theory of the soul. Okay, so that's a big ask, right? But let's see how much of it we can get a grips with. So, crucially, where Aquinas begins is by saying, well, by sort of saying where we should begin. Crucially, he thinks we have to begin with the most abstract and fundamental concepts. So for him, that's the concepts of being and essence. Right? And what he says is, as far as Aristotle is concerned, there are two senses of being. There's being as truth, and being as what is divided up by the categories. And essentially, the first thing he says, and this is where he's kind of obviously in dialogue with Augustine, is he says, yeah, okay, so there's a sense in which everything that we can judge, every true fact we can state, has some sort of being, right? But there are also what we might think about as negative facts, right? But it's not just a fact that, I use this all the time, that I'm wearing a blue jumper today. It's also a fact that I'm not wearing a red one. It's also a fact that there isn't an elephant in this room, right? He wants to say that fundamentally, right, what that means is that this sense of being is too broad. It doesn't give us any purchase on reality, right? Because it includes what Augustine would call privation, right? It includes some kind of nothing, right? So if we want to actually try and understand sort of being and essence, we need to go to look at the being of the category. And fundamentally, as I explained in the lecture on it in Sinner, what the categories do is to divide up all the different kinds of facts, to articulate all the different kinds of truths that can be, right? And these are always sort of split up into a subject and a predicate. Right? The subject being the thing you're talking about, say Socrates, and the predicate being the thing you're ascribing to, say humanity, right, or whiteness. Right? But equally, we can make judgments like, you know, cats are mammals, right? Cats being a subject, mammals being a predicate. We can also say things like whiteness is the colour that combines all the others. Right? And there, I'm talking about a quality as the subject, and I'm predicating something of it. So here we've got all these different kinds of facts, but what Aquinas wants to say is that the only way to understand these judgments of essence about things like qualities or relations or things that aren't substances is through understanding judgments about substance. Right? Fundamentally, the key feature of reality is the things that can have qualities or stand in relation to one another or be the agents of actions or the subjects of passions or any of the other categories we could talk about. I don't know time-wise. Okay. So, in essence, what he's saying is that the essence of substances is sort of more important than the essence of accident. Understanding the essence of humans, right, is more important than understanding the essence of whiteness or whatever other things we might ascribe. Okay. Then you have this question, okay, well, so what exactly is essence? Talk a bit about this in the lecture on living sinner again. Aquinas gives us sort of 4 different options. Sort of says, like, first of all, we talk about essence as quiddity, right, which basically just means whatness. Essence is what something is. Right? He's got no problem with that. Then, another thing that sometimes people talk about as being the essence of something is its form, in this kind of Aristotelian sense of form we've been dealing with for the past few weeks. Right? So the essence of the statue is its shape. Right? And then finally, we have essence thought of as definition. He also talks about nature here, which can be a bit confusing in the text. But basically the difference between definition and nature is simply the difference between the sort of linguistic and the thing that the language is talking about. So when I say man is a rational animal, yeah, of course I'm going to express that in language. It's a kind of linguistic definition. But what I'm talking about is the nature of the thing. Now, the argument, the cosmological argument that Aquinas develops is based on considering these different ways of thinking about essence as it applies to different types of being. So, in order just to make this completely clear, I'm going to run through how definition works again. So, in Aristotle, what we have are these kind of hierarchies of genera and species. So I've talked about how, we can see like, okay, there might be a concept like animal, right? And then under that we've got like mammals and reptiles. And under here we've got sort of cat and dog. And you might wonder, what's the sort of highest genera here? Well, that's substance. Right? These are the different types of substance there can be. The top is substance. Now, similarly, this works for the other categories as well. So, these are the kind of ultimate genera. So, quality, we might come down and talk about, well, colours are quality, and then like white, black. Right? But I don't know, maybe temperature is also quality. And so on. This is how Aristotle thinks about the world. And crucially, as you come down these hierarchies, you get more and more determinate. Right? So what Aristotle will talk about is what he calls specific difference. So like, what's the specific difference of man as opposed to cat and dog? Well, it's rationality. As far as he's concerned, what defines man as man is rationality. Right? We are the rational animal. But similarly, you can come up with other definitions for other things. I'm trying to think of one that's remotely interesting. Like, well, mammal. Let's look at mammals, right? Mammals are mammals because they're breastfed. If you talk about reptiles, what's specific about reptiles as opposed to, say, like monotremes or some other weird kind of animals? Well, they're cold-blooded. They can't internally regulate their heat. Right? This is how Aristotle thinks we categorize the world. We find the specific thing that determines a given species as opposed to the other species in the same category. Now, here's the tricky bit. How do we get from specific difference to individual? How do we get from dog to Fido? An actual individual dog? Is it just more and more and more specific differences? Or is there something else that makes the individual different from the species? So, basically, Aquinas is going to talk about 3 different kinds of things. On the one hand, we have composites. On the other hand, we have intelligences. And then finally, we have God. So how do we think about the essence of composites? Composites are just things that are a unity of form and matter. So I've talked about the statue before. Right? Well, I can equally say this about any material being. Right? The crucial thing that Aquinas says is that for these things, essence can't be the same thing as form. Right? Why? Because he thinks that things that are material are essentially material. Right? The essence of a human being includes that it is made of matter. Right? And not even just any matter, but actually of sort of types of matter. Right? We are made of flesh and bone. Right? You might wonder how this kind of hierarchy of matter works. And actually there's something like this again. We get sort of specific types of matter going to more general types of matter. And in the end we have what Aristotle calls prime matter, which is just pure potentiality. So clay can be made into a variety of different things, but you can't make a human being out of clay. It's only got certain kinds of potential. But prime matter, that can be anything. Here's what's important, is that when it comes to the question, why are there any given number of a different species? Why are there this many dogs? Why are there this many rhinos? Why are there no passenger pigeons anymore? Right? For animals that have become extinct. Right? Individual difference is material. Right? The thing that gets us from a lowest level species like dog to Fido is the fact that Fido is made out of some specific matter. Right? That's the thing that means there are different dogs. They could be qualitatively the same. We could have 3 cloned Fidos, but what makes them 3 is that there's different matter that they're made of. Interestingly enough, and this is one of the points I'll throw in here, Aquinas explicitly says that the essence of mathematical things, like numbers or shapes, like a triangle, right, can be form. Mathematical objects don't have to be made out of any particular matter. Right. Triangle can be thought ideally, and we can make a variety of them in the world. But they're not part of its essence. Okay, right, that's composite being. Right, so what determines individual difference is matter, how there can be multiple. When it comes to intelligence, right, Aquinas actually says no, for intelligences, essence does equal form. And what he's thinking about here is not necessarily just us, he's thinking about angels. He thinks that angels and God have intelligence, right? Just like we do. In fact, he thinks they are better intelligences than we are. But if essence is given by form, individual difference can't be given by matter, right? So for individuality simply is species, right? So he thinks that basically for angels, there's a, let's put it here, there's a genus of angels, right? And then there's a certain number of species, right? And each one of those is a unique angel. Right? The angels aren't differentiated by matter, and indeed, this is why he thinks you can have two angels in the same place, because nothing can rub up against each other if they're not made out of it. Okay. How does this then work in relation to God? Well, this is where things start looking like Maimonides. For Aquinas, God is that thing for which essence simply is its existence. Right? And what this means is, well, this is crucially related to his conception of God following Aristotle as the first cause. Crucially, this is to say, as the ultimate efficient cause, the ultimate formal cause, and the ultimate final cause of everything in the world. Because the way this gets interpreted is that God is pure actuality. God is pure act. God is purely active and has no passivity in it. Okay. I'm taking more time than I was hoping. Well, let's do the cosmological argument. This actually, once you understand all of that, this is actually very simple. There are two sides to the cosmological argument, right? One is showing that God exists, right? Existence. And this is the bit that's like Ibn Sina. The other side is showing that not only does God exist, but that God is unique. And this is the bit that looks like Maimonides. How does this work? Well, everything has basically been set up for us. So Aquinas can ask, what's the difference between essence and its existence? What's the difference between the essence of cat, right, and the fact that there are actually however many millions of cats there are in the world? Or the essence of dodo and the fact that there are no dodos, right? What's the difference? Well, what he'll say is, it's got to be caused by something. Right? There's got to be a cause for why there is a specific number of anything. Right? When you ask about that cause, you go, well, why does it exist? And then we're back into regress. Right? Existence has to be caused by existence. And at some point, these things that are other caused have to terminate in something that's self-caused. Right? There's got to be something that merely exists in virtue of its essence. Right? Existence is part of its essence, or rather just is its essence. Here's the thing though. Ibn Sina didn't consider the possibility that there might be multiple self-caused things. Why are there just a bunch of different self-caused gods bringing stuff into existence? Right? This is why we need the uniqueness argument. And this is where this idea from Maimonides that God is defined by existence, God's essence simply is existence, actually comes into play. different types of multiplicity. So we can ask, could there be multiple gods because of the matter they were made out of? Right? Could there be multiple gods like we had multiple different clones of Fido? No, God is immaterial. Right? There is no matter, right, to turn the essence into multiple different things. And then we might ask, okay, but could God be multiple like angels? Could specific difference be enough? Right? Could it just be that there's this concept of God which can be instantiated in different ways because there's different species, different ideas of God? Right? Like a wrathful God and a loving God, or however we were to break down the concept. Aquinas' point is, God has no definition. Right? God's essence isn't given by a definition. This whole process of working from genus to species and figuring out what defines the nature of something does not apply to God. God sits at the top of the hierarchy, wherever it is. He's up here somewhere. Right? What that means is, all of the ways we have of understanding how something might be many do not apply to God. God must be one because the very idea of there being many doesn't make any sense within the Aristotelian framework. So that's it. There's got to be something self-caused, and it can only be one. There we are. We can argue with the existence of God. Here's what comes out of this. Here's the thing that's kind of weird and wonderful. So this is metaphysics. But what we actually get out of this is also epistemology. Right? Because we've got this definition of intelligence. Right? So Aquinas thinks that what it is for an intelligence to know things in the world, right, is to know the natures of these other things, to grasp what these definitions are describing. Right? And he thinks how this works is like imprinting. The nature of things in the world gets imprinted on the soul. Right? It's like the soul is made of wax, right? And experience stamps things into that wax. Except, he's already said that intelligences can't be made of matter. If that can't be made of matter, how can this like wax-like imprinting process work? Well, what he says is, actually, it turns out that not all potential is material. Intelligences can have potential, which can then be actualized, which doesn't come about from being materially instantiated. So now he's saying that like God is pure act. God has no potential whatsoever. God is pure activity. Right? It turns out intelligences have degrees of actuality and potentiality. And this is the hierarchy of angels. Angels at the top are closer to God. They have more actuality, which is to say, they have more knowledge just built into them. Right? And a certain amount of potentiality to receive this from God. Right? But as we go further and further down the hierarchy, we get further and further away and more into potential rather than actuality. So that's our angelology. But it also gives us an anthropology. It gives us a theory of human beings. Because human beings are what's at the bottom. Right? Human beings are intelligences that are pure potential. We don't come with anything. We have to learn everything through experience. Okay? So, just as I said, there's kind of prime matter in Aristotle. There's this pure matter, which is just pure potential. And humans are the prime matter of the intellectual part of the universe. Anything can be imposed upon. Right? And this is quite interesting, because this is his theory as to why human beings essentially have a body. He says, as intellectual matter, we necessarily accrue actual matter. Right? We are the thing that stands at the boundary between the intelligible and the sensible. Right? We cross the gap between the intellectual universe and the material one. That's where we sit. So, I have two final things I'd like to talk about. But just to rehearse that, we've been given a cosmological argument, but all of the machinery that has to be built up, all the distinctions that have to be made for that argument to work, also then give us an epistemology, which gives us an angelology and an anthropology. Right? All just comes out of the same machinery that's been built to prove that God exists. How might you disagree with it? What might be wrong with it? Well, here's two thoughts. I was originally going to give this lecture on a local philosopher, John Duns Scotus, who is the kind of major figure in scholasticism who comes after Aquinas. And Duns Scotus takes issue with this, the way in which Aquinas thinks this difference between creator and created. Because the way in which Aquinas understands this is in the same way that Maimonides does. He says God is simple. And fundamentally that means we can't say anything about God's essence. We can't define God. Right? And this produces difficulties for talking about God. Like, what Aquinas has to do is to develop a theory of what gets called analogy. Sometimes it's talked about in terms of equivocity. And what this means is that, yeah, there are simply two completely different kinds of being. Right? One that applies to God, and one that applies to his creatures. So when I say something like God is wise, right, I'm just saying something that's kind of analogous to saying that man is wise. Really, that property can't be said to be had by God and creatures in the same way. Right? This makes it very, very hard to say anything about God. But it kind of provides a more sort of precise version of what we've talked about under the heading of negative theology. All of the stuff that's kind of negative that we can't say just gets bundled up as, well, you're just kind of making an analogy. You're not saying anything literal? That's fine. Duns Scotus, on the other hand, wants to talk about univocity. He wants to say, look, unless there's a single kind of being which is held by everything in common, theology is pointless. We have to be able to say certain things about God that are not analogical. We need to be able to understand the precise sense in which God's wisdom differs from man's wisdom. And the way he does this is by saying that rather the important distinction is that between finite and infinite being. So here we can actually think of being as being like a genus, and there being a difference between finite and infinite being. And this goes back to Anselm, and certainly we're talking about perfection again, where we're saying, yeah, it makes sense to call God wise because God is perfectly wise. That's the difference between God and man. Infinity, perfection, unlimited. Right. That's the history of Christian theology. One final thing, and hopefully you might want to talk about this in seminars. You know, at the beginning I talked about Rockwood's Basilisk. And I said Christians were interesting because they're some of the first people to think about personal identity. Because they were interested in what would it be if you resurrected. Like, do we have to have a body, or can simply the soul come back? Right? Now, remember what I said about Aquinas here? He said that not just angels can be defined by form, right? Their essence is form, also mathematical things. Right? Here's a thing that can be mathematically described: a computer program. What makes one computer program into two different ones? What is the difference between the same computer program and different instantiations that are running? Right. What this sort of shows is that the ways in which Aquinas is thinking about the identity of the soul and the nature of the soul, its immateriality, suddenly start looking applicable to things like artificial intelligence. Or more crazily, in the Rockwood's Basilisk case, to mind uploading. If I upload your mind to a computer program, I can instantiate that as many times as I like. So what does it mean for those things to be the same person? Right? This is what I was saying is, if you have intuitions about these things, if you want to say, look, that copy of me that this weird artificial intelligence is going to be torturing in the future isn't me, that's just some program, then you were interested in theology and its philosophical legacy. Thank you for watching, guys. I hope you got something out of the course.